My interest in Palestine, obviously, because I'm Palestinian, but there's more to it. I mean, it's not just a matter for me of my ethnic origin. That's an accident. And my interest in the Palestinian movement was that it's, first of all, a nationalist movement of resistance, of anti-colonial resistance. But also in that, even more important, that within the Arab setting, the Palestinian movement represented a radicalizing movement that not only brought up the question of nationhood for the Palestinians, which was, of course, central, but also that raised other questions of social justice, of the absence of discrimination, and above all, freedom. And I thought my role as an intellectual in the West, you see, was to speak out about this. And at the beginning, my assertions were basically assertions, affirmations of the existence of Palestinians. In 1969, Golda Meir said there were no Palestinians. So it was my role to, I felt, to demonstrate the existence of the Palestinian people. And in addition to that, also within the Palestinian context, to try to represent a secular alternative, which was the principle of the movement, I believe. I still think it was principally a secular movement, as against movements that began to appear in the Arab world, the Arab and Islamic world, that seemed to be reversions to a nativist and primitivist, in my opinion, path. The case of the Iranian Revolution, which I supported. I supported it as a social and political revolution. I didn't support it later on when it became a tyrannical Islamic revolution, and of course I couldn't support it in its attack on Salman Rushdie, for instance. Similarly, in my part of the world, in the Arab Islamic world, I supported secular alternative movements, the women's movements, the human rights movement, the movements for freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. At the same time that I recognized that what was gripping the population was the idea of a return to Islam. Islamic restorationist movement. I've always been critical of them, and I've always expressed my criticism in public by saying that we can't, in the end of the 20th century, return to some earlier ideal. A, because the ideal is irrecoverable, and B, because all such returns involve a new politics of domination, you know, and essentially authoritarianism, dogmatism, whereas I felt the role of the intellectual and the role of the Palestinian movement was effectively to present a new critical understanding of the contemporary world. Well, I think what Orientalism did was to make people sensitive to the notion of representation, that how you talk about another people involves politics, it involves power, it involves a contest of some sort. Previously, it had been thought that it was perfectly okay for European and American Orientalists or scientists to speak about the Orient in a general sense, because they were never thought to be, Orientalists were never thought to be the audience. It was for the West. And what I tried to do, was to focus on the fact that ideas like Orient and Occident, like notions of national identity and so on, were basically constructions. And they served particular purposes of knowledge, which was always affiliated to a particular power situation. I think that's now come to be more widely accepted since I wrote Orientalism, that people no longer believe, with a few exceptions, that there's such a thing as a social or human science that is entirely objective, disinterested, neutral, impartial. So I think that's been one notion that's been successful, I think. Another one is that, you know, that the people themselves have a right to represent themselves in question, you see, and it's not just the Westerner speaking about the Oriental, but the Oriental can represent himself or herself. And the idea of distinctions and discriminations made in making large generalizations has now also become, I think, widely acknowledged as a result of Orientalism. Now, there are two other things that are, in my opinion, tremendous misunderstandings of Orientalism that have bothered me, is that it's been taken by a lot of people to be a book that is basically anti-Western. And of course, the whole point of the book is that labels like West and East and Occident and Orient, etc., are ideological constructions. They're not representative of the whole actuality, because I say the whole actuality can't be represented. You can't really say what the Orient is. I never try to say that. And in fact, part of I think the difficulty of the book is that I make the case that, let's say, Flaubert on the one hand, and Massignon, a 20th century French Orientalist, are very different, let's say, from somebody like Ernest Renan, who hated the Semitic peoples, or Bernard Lewis, who also has a tremendous dislike for the Arabs and for Islam. So there are gradations within Orientalism that I think are lost in the debate now about Islam versus the West and so on and so forth. People think I'm part of that debate. I'm not. And the other misunderstanding of the book, which is quite widespread, is that somehow the book is taken to be a disguised defense of Islam and the Arabs. And in fact, I say nothing about Islam or the Arabs in the book. I simply say that the terms used to describe them are inadequate for the following reasons. They're general, they're hostile, etc., etc. But I don't advance the thesis in that book that the Arabs are such and such, or that Islam is such and such. But by many Muslims in the Islamic world, my book is taken to be, in fact, a defense of a pure Islam, which is totally against my beliefs. So, I mean, those are some of the things. Most of the discussions that I knew about that concern imperialism tended to look at imperialism as basically an economic and political process. And the argument that I make about imperialism is that it's, at least in the Western instance, that is to say, the great empires, the British and the French principally, then the American, after the end of the 18th century, were different from other empires in two main ways. One is that they were systematic enterprises. They were not expeditions to go and get gold. Nor were they necessarily only acts of settlement, but they were continuous invested in processes that compelled and subjugated people at a great distance. So the idea of overseas empire is important here. I mean, why did an Englishman think, for example, in the 19th century, like John Stuart Mill, that it was the destiny of England to rule India 8, 9, 10,000 miles away? Interesting idea. And the second component here is that culture plays a very important role. In fact, I would say that culture prepares the way for the great systematic enterprise by allowing people to think in Europe that it was their natural duty, obligation, destiny to expand, and that the culture allowed them this idea, you know, in a number of ways. The superiority of Western civilization, the technological advancement, the inferiority of native peoples, and so on and so forth. And these ideas, I found, are very prevalent not only in the obviously imperialist writers at the end of the 19th century, like Kipling and Conrad, but also in novelists in particular, like Jane Austen and Dickens, who wrote at a much earlier period before the formal age of empire that, according to Hobsbawm, begins at the end of the end of the 19th century. So empire, from my point of view, is a much more widespread notion than simply going out and getting property. Yeah? And I was interested in the cultural component because the cultural component, to a large degree, has been hidden. It's not been talked about. The assumption has been that somehow culture is exempt from these sordid practices, and I try to show that that through a political analysis of culture, that culture plays a very important political role, legitimizing, enabling, preparing, consolidating attitudes of reference to geography, let's say, and to other peoples, that persist throughout imperialism and can only be defeated by the resistance of people elsewhere. Now, one of the resistances to empire is, of course, the sense that we are not simply native people or colored people or inferior races, but that we have our own traditions. We have a long history of language, culture, etc., which has to be asserted to confront the British and the French. In Africa, it was originally, for example, the idea of going back to native costume, to native habits, to separating from the white man. But more important than that, I think, is the founding of opposition parties. Let's say by the end of the 19th century, for example, in India, the Congress Party was established in the 1880s. They were nationalist parties that tried to reassert through literature, through history, through language, a sense of a native identity that was free of the British, in the case of the Indians, right? And this identity acquires a tremendous prominence in the politics of imperialism as an oppositional identity. And, of course, it flowers into what we call nationalism, right? But I would argue that nationalism comes from the West. I mean, I think it's to be found wherever there is a sense of peoplehood, a sense of belonging, which always exists. I mean, we know this in all cases. And I think one of the arguments made by people in the West today is that nationalism, like Ernest Gellner, that nationalism is incomprehensible without the West. I think that's nonsense. I mean, nationalism is to be found in different ways. It doesn't always express itself in the need or the desire to have a state or a nation, but it expresses itself in various ideas of community, imagined communities, as Benedict Anderson refers to it. So I think in all of this, what is most important for me is the sense of the dynamic sense that identities are always constructions, that cultural contests always include politics, and that there's a large element of change and criticism involved here. That is to say, amongst the great nationalist parties of the Third World, this is frequently overlooked. In the case of India, for example, the role of Tagore, who was a national poet and writer, he won the Nobel Prize, but he was a nationalist. At the same time, he was critical of nationalism. He said, we mustn't repeat the mistakes. Fanon said the same thing about the Algerian Revolution in the late 50s and the early 60s, that we can't repeat the depredations of the West. We have to be critical of our own nationalism. There has to be a social transformation. So I think that establishes, you might say, the play of what I was trying to do in Culture and Imperialism. The contemporary Greek, you see, has suffered in many ways some of the fate of the contemporary Arab and Muslim. That is to say, he or she is the last person to be heard from. I mean, there's a great deal of talk, for example, in the Islamic world by Orientalists who talk about classical Islam, who talk about the Arabs, right, as a people basically who emerged into world history in the 7th and 8th centuries. The same is true of the Greeks. I mean, the contemporary Greeks are rarely talked about, but they are referred to much more than the Arabs as the country, the nation, the place in which Western civilization began. And there are many claims made about Greece and Greek democracy and Greek culture and Attic civilization and so on and so forth that make no reference whatever, A, to the continuing history of a Greek nation that may have begun with Homer, but continues really through the 13th and 15th and 19th and 20th centuries, with a people that is transformed through ethnic hybridity, through continual cultural change, and through wars and occupations and so on and so forth, that has an identity of its own, that has a literature of its own, that obviously has a language of its own. All of this is put aside. Secondly, the claims made for the Greek ideal, historically and classically, has always been to detach the Greek ideal from its setting, that is, its geographical setting, which is precisely Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean would involve, obviously, the connection between Greece not only looking to the west, but Greece looking to the east, the relationship between Greece and Turkey, animosity and so on and so forth, but also between the Greeks and the Semites, between the Greeks and the Africans, between the Greeks and the Asians and so on, where Greek science and Greek commerce and Greek civilization played an extraordinary role, being infiltrated by, and it presents a much more complex picture, all of which comes down to the present, where Greek politics and Greek culture in the contemporary stage have a life of their own, which are completely, again, sort of occluded, marginalized. So in that respect, I think there's a great community here of, I call it a Levantine community, or Mediterranean community, of Greeks, Arabs, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and so on and so forth, which, for example, in the case of my own identity, I should mention this, that my father's family, before we converted, my grandfather converted to Protestantism, were Greek Orthodox. I mean, the presence of Greek Orthodox communities in the Arab world has a fantastic importance on the relationship between Greeks and the Arab world, and you might say Greek civilization, Arab civilization, that is completely unknown. I was very attracted to Cavafis because, obviously, I mean, I spent the early part of my life in Egypt. And one of the great presences in my life, when I was growing up in Egypt, was the Greek community. Many Greeks were in school with me. I went to a multicultural school, right, which was an English school. I mean, the English tried to make it into an English school, which it was. But at the same time, it was a multicultural school in that there were no English students in the school. They were all Arabs, and I mean from various parts of the Arab world, Jordanians, Palestinians, Saudi Arabians, Syrians, etc. Many Jews, Eastern Jews, you know, from Iraq and Egypt and so on, plus many Greeks. So I had many Greek classmates, and Armenians, Italians. So it was a Levantine school, basically. And it wasn't really until after I left Egypt to come to America, my family remained there for a while, but it wasn't really until the 60s or the 70s that I became aware of Cavafis as a kind of emblem of this culture, which hitherto I'd only known through the bastardized versions of Durrell. I mean, you know, the Alexandria Quartet and so on and so forth, which I think is a debased form of all this. Anyway, I discovered Cavafis' poetry through the translations that became available in the, I forget what year it was, in this, do you know? 61? But published, in the 60s, I guess it was. And what particularly impressed me about him was that this quite remarkable, I'd never seen it before, really. You don't see it in Arabic literature of the time. You certainly don't see it, I didn't see it in any of the European literature that was written about or in the Arab world. There's not much of it. That is, it's quite extraordinary amalgam between, on the one hand, an obviously Greek identity writing in contemporary Greek, but at the same time making contemporary to each other the Alexandrian world, right, and the classical world. And this remarkable sort of intercourse that he quite managed between these worlds suggested to me a whole new prototype for the writing of modern poetry that was much closer to me than, say, the work of T.S. Eliot and Auden, whom I admired, or even Yeats, and much more present to me in some way, in an anguished sort of way, because I didn't know modern Greek, so I read him only in translations. I also discovered, you know, the remarkable work of people like Marguerite Yourcenar, who did the first French translation of his work, and then began to see traces of Cavafis in other writers, even Greeks in America writing about Cavafis in English. I mean, that was a whole new thing. And it gave a new profile to me of the Mediterranean writer, or Levantine writer, who was really not just Greek, but also part of the common heritage of Arabs like myself, who were interested in Western as well as non-Western literature. It did a lot, but better now. I think because I discovered that my counts have gone down, so it's worked. It's working. But I have to, I have to do it for 6 months, 5 days a month, 6 months, and I think my hair will begin to fall out. I think it doesn't happen to everyone, but it's a calendar for at least 2 months. I said, I can't do that. I'm not going to become an invalid for you. He said, no, but so I said, the week I have chemotherapy, I have to give 2 lectures, one at Pennsylvania, that's what I saw about, and then I went up to Cornell and I spoke to an audience of 1,900 people. Beginnings was my first theoretical book. It was published in 1974, and in it I traced the first ideas I had about the secular world. It was very influenced by Vico, and it was a very important book for me. Orientalism was published in 1978 and became my most famous book, although I'm not sure it's my best book, but it's been translated into about 16 or 17 languages. This is the book that came right after Orientalism, The Question of Palestine. I'm particularly fond of this because it was the first book in English published by a major commercial press to put forward the Palestinian point of view for a European, or rather a Western audience. It's never been translated into Arabic, although it's been translated into Hebrew. This, I think, is probably the book that contains most of my major cultural and literary ideas. It's a collection of essays, but they're connected, and the notion of secular criticism was developed in this book. Musical Elaborations is the book on music that I published as a series of lectures, and it was really a great pleasure for me to do because I'd never written about music or lectured about music before, and I was quite nervous about doing it, but my idea was to talk about music from my point of view, not as a musicologist, but for a cultural and literary audience, and I think it was quite a successful book. This is perhaps After the Last Sky. The title comes from a poem by Mahmoud Darwish, who is the national Palestinian poet and a very dear friend of mine. It's the most personal book I wrote. It was published in 1986, and it has wonderful photographs by the Swiss photographer Jean Moore. And it's a kind of personal meditation on various aspects of Palestinian life, along with the pictures of places in Palestine and people that I, in many instances, didn't know. I didn't go to Palestine for the first time until 1992, after, that is to say, my family left in 1947. So this was a kind of a book, an exile book about Palestinians. Unfortunately, I would say by the late 80s, there was a transformation of the Palestinian movement. So much so that mistakes were made at the time of the Gulf War, and there was also a tremendous sense of subservience, what I call willing subservience, that they felt that with the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, that one had to throw oneself in the arms of America. And here, my role became doubly critical. That is to say, I was not only continuing to speak about Palestinian self-determination and freedom from oppression and dialogue and a political resolution, which I always believed was the only resolution, not through armed struggle, but also because I believed that decisions made, mostly represented by the Declaration of Principles in Oslo that was signed on the White House lawn in September of last year, were tremendous mistakes. They were diversions from liberation, and in fact, the leadership represented by Yasser Arafat of the PLO had put itself in the position of accepting a role that was subordinate to Israel, that the PLO would become the enforcer of the occupation since the Israelis were going to remain, their army, their settlements, and so on, with tragic results that we saw in Hebron on February the 25th, and many others like that. And B, because I think the Palestinian leadership under Yasser Arafat also thought that by making this deal secretly with Israel, they would save themselves. And I felt they completely disregarded the interest of the large mass of the people, 50% of whom don't live in Palestine, are stateless refugees in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and so on. And that, in effect, the movement had abandoned its liberationist ideal and became the first, I say this with a great deal of shame as a Palestinian, that we are the first liberation movement in the 20th century to have made a deal with the occupation before the end of the occupation. No other liberation movement did it. And I think instead of it, as they represent it, as being an important achievement, I think it was a tremendous capitulation. So I've kept up as much as I can the struggle against the leadership. I do it publicly in the Arabic press, but also in the European and English and American press. But because of my illness, I don't feel I can participate more than that in politics. But I believe the only answer is a change in the leadership and a new direction for the struggle. Yeah, I mean, I think the intellectual, broadly considered, let's say, the way Gramsci defines the intellectual, is part, let's say, is an organic part of the nationalist movements. And the interesting thing about the intellectual here, at least in imperialism, it's not necessarily a left intellectual or a right intellectual. You might say there's a kind of consensus on the question of empire. On the left, on the right, in the middle, it was considered to be a natural thing to do. Now, of course, in the non-European world, in Africa and Asia and so on, the intellectual, I think, plays a very important role in the emergence of a nationalist consciousness. That is to say, it could be a writer. I mean, I take the example of Yeats, who was a great poet. He was a national poet. He was very much attached to a kind of mythological Ireland. But because he was such a great poet and he played a part in the Irish Renaissance at the end of the 19th century, he was thought of as a nationalist poet because, of course, he was very anti-British. But more important than that, he established a kind of consciousness of Irish destiny, if you like, of Irish resistance to the British, and a separate Irish national mission. And I think this is one of the main roles intellectuals play, is to create that new consciousness. But of course, there are different ways in which it occurs. I mean, poetry is one way. Another way is the people who, for example, in the Arab world, who are very important in what is called the Renaissance of the Arab world, the Arab Nahda. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the revival of the Arabic language, its modernization, the telling of stories, narratives about Arab history that were introduced into the Arab world, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, but also dominated by the British and the French, to sort of give a new sense of identity to Arabs, that they might understand their own history in a different and independent way. Now, in all of this, I think one sees the role here of intellectuals as, if you like, poets and priests at the same time. There was a kind of proselytizing, missionary quality to it. That we need to do this. They are summoning the nation. You also see it in Russia, for example, in the 19th century. So the intellectual as a missionary. But what interests me more is it possible to distinguish in this movement intellectuals who, in addition to being mobilizers of opinion, also bring with them another attribute, which I would call not only secular, that is to say, they're talking about this world, not the next world. There's no appeal to transcendental others and so on and so forth. So transcendental ideas and transcendental others. But also intellectuals who keep saying, you know, in addition to what we're doing now, we must think that there are limits to power. Do we want, Fanon said, do we want the black policeman simply to fill the role of the white policeman? Or do we want a different consciousness that would transform society into an egalitarian one, in which injustice was eliminated, in which power was curtailed? So to my view, therefore, the role of the intellectual today as a secular intellectual, not appealing to tribe, flag, nation, religion, but rather to critical values that have to do with freedom from oppression, injustice, and above all, the unmasking of the corporate images put out by the state, the media, and all the regimentalized authorities of society. Well, I think Adorno represents for me one of the models of the European-style intellectual who grew up in the period before the Second World War and during it, but I think he's unique in the sense that he's the only Western intellectual and philosopher that I know of a major standing, whose principal focus, and I think one can trace it in all of his, even his most recondite philosophical work, his principal focus is music. And for him, music represents a kind of the most refined, that is to say, the most elusive at the same time, but also the most obvious sign of the bourgeoisie, right, through all of its manifestations, beginning with the withdrawal of Beethoven in the third period to a new realm, the birth of collective passions and so on and so forth that emerge in fascism and Stalinism, but also a kind of revolt against that in the work of people like Schoenberg, a kind of new definition which is so difficult. The idea of difficulty is central to Adorno, and he also represents to me the philosophical and intellectual consciousness of refusing to be compromised, refusing to compromise. In this respect, he's a great model, that nothing that he ever says can be paraphrased. There's a kind of extremism in his writing which is impossible to fulfill. In the end, he becomes even impossible to read. But it's a kind of a model for an intellectual who strives for a certain kind of ideal precision, no matter what the difficulty is, and a kind of intransigence, which I respect. In a certain sense, Chomsky is related to Adorno in America today, because he, too, speaks against the consensus. And in a certain sense, he's never been accommodated or co-opted. He's never been asked by the major newspapers to write an op-ed piece, for example. And what he says goes completely against the grain of the current American wisdom, especially in political science and social thought. But I think also what Chomsky has that Adorno didn't have is Chomsky has the capacity to reach large audiences, because he's an accessible man. And unlike Adorno, he doesn't try to hide inside his prose. There's a kind of vulnerability and openness there, which is completely unique amongst American intellectuals. In other words, he doesn't hide in the academy. He's available to movements in the third world, to people at a great distance. And of course, he represents a kind of intellectual conscience that has a lot to do, I think, with atoning for American crimes, the corporate and statist crimes of America around the world, especially in Vietnam, which is where he came to prominence. And in that respect, he strikes me also, although he isn't for many people, but for me, he strikes me as a kind of model of the intellectual. Somebody who is not afraid to be wrong, but above all, is not afraid to take risks, at great personal cost to himself. And of course, he's indefatigable. He turns out this relentlessly, his works, that whether he repeats himself or not, whether he's absolutely right, at least in general, one can't but respect and admire. And I think that's terribly important. In that sense, he's quite unique. And I would be happier if he were more of a model for most intellectuals, but he isn't.